the star-filled nights, month of full.
Hello, Professor Philipp Blom. This is a pleasure to have you here with us in the project.
Well, it's very kind of you. I have to correct you straight away. I'm not a professor. I don't teach at a university. I just sit at home and write.
You write in history and quite interesting books. Professor Philipp Blom, you have several books. Not all of them has come to Mexico City, but most of them, yes. And you're a scholar that write on cultural history. Why cultural history? Or what do you understand with cultural history?
You know, I've always thought I'm an historian, but more and more I come to suspect I'm actually an anthropologist. I'm interested in what makes people tick, why they see the world in a certain way, who they think they are, why they behave like they behave. And I think that is something particularly pertinent for philosophy, because philosophy is usually portrayed as a sort of disembodied discipline of ideas that float around like soap bubbles. But philosophical ideas and concepts come out of very concrete social, economic, cultural contexts and personal contexts. And they couldn't come about in any other way. And so I try to reconstruct that. I've written something in the 18th century, and just to give you one example, if you look at Diderot, it is very important to know that he wanted to become a priest as a young man, that his father was a very pious man and a very dominant man, that he lived at a time, at the first time in human history, when science really began to make a difference to the world. Those things illuminate his ideas. I mean, this is an old debate, whether this sort of place in life of ideas has also a place in scholarship. You know, you can ask it about musicians. Is it helpful to know that Richard Wagner was an absolute bastard? Well, probably not. It's interesting, but it doesn't make the music better or worse. But I think for philosophy, because philosophy is about human lives, or it should be about human lives, that's why we're interested in it. And so I think the connection with the human lives from which it came is important. So, you know, I'm not so much interested in history and what happens, but in why and how it happens, in the smaller things.
In this case, you talk about, in two of your books, you write about Diderot. Why Diderot? You seem to love the character.
Yeah, I do love the character. I mean, I love him as a man. I mean, it's a kind of man I would love to invite for a dinner party. I would love to have as a friend. But more importantly, there are various things. First of all, I think his ideas genuinely can illuminate questions of the present. And that has something to do with the fact, I mean, Diderot as a philosopher is practically forgotten outside of the university, outside of university faculties. And that is not an accident. That is not because he wasn't a good philosopher. I think he was very important. It is because another Enlightenment won the battle of history. The deist, moderate Enlightenment won the battle of history. And I think that is very strange because with the deist, moderate Enlightenment of, say, Kant and Voltaire, you can justify a hold on power for a bourgeoisie, for an educated bourgeoisie, in the 19th and 20th centuries. We can perhaps go further into that if you're interested, but with Diderot's and Holbach's philosophy, which is a philosophy ultimately of radical solidarity, you can't do that. And therefore they were very skeptical about power, about the justification of power, about who was allowed, who should be allowed to hold any power at all. And of course, powerful people don't like that very much. So Diderot he couldn't be completely ignored because he was too important a figure. So he was repainted into this encyclopedist who wrote a few interesting novels. And the other thing, of course, is that Diderot was not a systematic thinker. Now here's something else that I found interesting about reading philosophy historically. Very often when people read philosophy, they ignore the circumstances under which it came about. Diderot, for instance, is always attacked for his inconsistency. He says one thing one day and one thing another. That has partly something to do with his character. He himself says, my real opinion is not the opinion I've always held, but the opinion to which I return most often. Which I think is a wonderful quote. But it is also, of course, to do with the fact that he had to write under a Catholic censorship, and that if he spoke his mind, he could be executed. So there are the things that he writes for publication, in which he has to present himself as a deist. Although he goes very far. I mean, for instance, the article Autorité politique in l'Encyclopédie, au droit naturel, says very clearly a king derives his power and legitimacy from the people. And if he betrays that, then he has no longer any right to be king, and he actually should be chased. I don't know how he got that through the census, but he did. Then there's Diderot, who writes for a small select public. For instance, the Correspondance littéraire, which was published by a friend of his and which wasn't subject to censorship because censorship only applied to printed things, and these things were copied handwritten. So, or for instance, and they can be a little more open, but his name is attached to it. And then there's Diderot, the anonymous author, and the author of letters to his friends, and there he's completely open. And for instance, in the Histoire de deux Indes, the great anti-colonialist work of the 18th century, where he very movingly, very strongly speaks against these structures of oppression in colonialism, but also in other contexts. So, just to say this is written by Diderot, therefore it has to be consistent, is nonsense historically. You have to see in which situation, it was like writing in the Soviet Union. It was like writing in Franco's Spain. You couldn't always say what you wanted.
Though at times he was not consistent, sometimes he has to change his opinions. He never went against the Enlightenment.
No.
In the book Encyclopedia, you talk about Rousseau, but when you talk about Rousseau, you talk about, at least for me, a different Rousseau that I never saw.
Yes.
The one that first he is very excited about the Enlightenment, but later on.
You see, this is something fascinating. Diderot and Rousseau are basically twins. They're born 1 year from each other. Rousseau in 1712, and Diderot in 1730. This is his 300th anniversary. Both their fathers are craftsmen and very strict, very authoritarian. They both grew up in a little provincial city, Diderot longer, Rousseau in Geneva. They both leave home at 15, and they're both very exercised by religious questions. Rousseau converts to Catholicism straight away, although that was also an opportunistic decision to some extent. Diderot goes to Paris to become a Jesuit. And there they meet. And they are inseparable. They are the best friends. Because they're so similar in so many ways. And then comes the moment of rupture. And again, you see how I find it interesting and important to connect biography and thought. Because basically they both are fighting with the same phenomenon. And that is, I said this is the beginning of the 18th century, is the first moment where science really makes a difference in history. It's just before the invention of inoculation, microscopy is developing. People have seen human sperm under a microscope. We know by now that the Earth is not the center of the universe, etc., etc. And both Diderot and Rousseau have a strong longing for belief, for faith. And they both find that it collides, is in conflict with the scientific knowledge which they absorb and discover.
In all your books, there is a Constance, that is the idea of progress. You like the idea of progress.
I'm very skeptical about the idea of progress.
Yes.
It's a great idea. I'm just not sure whether it really exists. I think we can perhaps talk about that later, but I think to some extent it probably does exist. But it is not the kind of linear thing that the deist Enlightenment makes out of it. And I need to come back to that because that is an important point. But let's just stay with Diderot and Rousseau for a moment, because they both have this longing to believe. They both come from a religious world. The thing is that they choose different paths to deal with this longing. Rousseau says in a letter to Voltaire, "I have suffered too much in this world that there should not be another world. I feel it. It is true. There must be another world." And out of that comes a situation of resistance, a posture of resistance against the world, a posture of contempt for progress, for rationality, a posture of contempt for debate, because basically for him, if you're not with him,
You're evil.
you're evil. It is not a question of arguing a point. If you are against this idea, then you are morally wicked. And of course that is also part of the reason why he then turns against not only progress but whole culture or civilization. And that is the reason why, as a mature man, he becomes very intensely authoritarian. His Contrat Social, I never know what book people read when they praise the Contrat Social and say this is a manual of freedom and free societies, because it is a blueprint for Stalinism. I don't need to exercise the arguments, you know them better than I do, but it is a great plea for an authoritarian society in which people with other ideas get exiled or executed. So I can't see where the wonderful liberating aspect of that is. Now the thing is, and this I think makes Diderot a truly important thinker. Rousseau is not an Enlightenment thinker. Rousseau is an anti-Enlightenment thinker. He starts out as a thinker in the Enlightenment, but he turns against the Enlightenment and all its proponents, and he tries to hurt them where he can. And he doesn't take up arms, but he does it in print. Diderot also has this longing for faith. He also would love to believe that there's the one great answer, the one great cosmic system, the one moral law. But he understands that it is wrong. And he understands, therefore, that his longing cannot be satisfied. And that means that his answer is not to, therefore, suppress and deny that longing, which is, would be a Freudian, almost a Freudian idea, but to learn to live with this longing in a constructive way. It is like a sexual longing. You can satisfy it sometimes for some period of time, but not always, and not in all its objects. And therefore you have to learn to live with it in a constructive way. Diderot does that by telling stories, by writing novels, in which he exercises the different ways in which faith and morality can be lived or denied. Romeo's nephew is the ultimate cynic who says there is no morality. It's all a stupid fairy tale and I take what I can. Jacques le Fataliste is the very opposite. He says everything is written above and whatever happens has been predetermined. And the interesting thing is in all of Diderot's dialogues, and Diderot writes most of the things in dialogue, there isn't one of the dialogue partner who represents Diderot's opinion and who is therefore right. They are always both compromised. They are always both seeking a way to live in this world in a constructive way. And I think that is, for me, a very realistic, very humanist approach to life. And of course it leads Diderot explicitly or implicitly to say, yes, we want the great answer, we cannot have it. It is not possible. We All we have is negotiation and improvisation, is trying to do our best in a given situation, but we cannot appeal to one iron moral law. There is no metaphysical nail on which to hang the world. And that is a very courageous thing, and I think also, this idea that, you can translate that and say, as human beings, and I believe this, as human beings we have a fundamental and immensely powerful need for transcendence. And we are willing to sacrifice very much to satisfy this need. We're willing to sacrifice our freedom, our comfort, sometimes our lives, to satisfy this need for transcendence. But of course, this chosen transcendence can become a prison. Diderot says, I recognize this need of transcendence in me, I just recognize I can't allow it. I have to play with it. I have to try to find ways of satisfying it sometimes, as we all do, when we engage with some form of story, some form of transcendence, when we read novels, when we go to the movies, when we go to the theatre. And we engage with this for a moment, but we also know to retreat from it again. We do not completely collapse into the story. So I think this is a very profoundly modern thought, contemporary thought, especially in a time when, after the waning of religion and the waning of the great ideologies, because we've seen their disastrous consequences, we have created ourselves another form of transcendence, which is the market, which works very much in the same way. We talk about the market as an objective reality outside of our society that needs to be satisfied, whose needs need to be satisfied unquestioningly. We seem to have forgotten that the market consists of people buying and selling things. That's us. But we talk about the market in an anthropomorphic way. We say the markets are worried, the markets are nervous, and then we need to sacrifice to them like to a deity. The market has its own prophets and its own priests.
We alienate ourselves.
Yes, but and it creates immense suffering because it gets you some people with a lot and an awful lot of people with nothing. But it gives us this transcendence. It satisfies our need for transcendence, and therefore we're willing to go along with it, or most people are willing to go along with it. And this Diderotian idea that yes, we need this. We need to engage with our need for transcendence, but we must not fall into it, because then we're essentially religious.
It's dogmatism.
Yes, and that is a very, very important, but of course also a very difficult idea, because it is not an idea where, it is not that you can convert to Diderotism, because there is no such ism. And it is not a question of conversion, because a conversion is essentially leaving one prison and entering another. And he says you have to think about prisons. You have to think about what it means to be free, because being free is very, very difficult. So because of those things, I think Diderot is a figure who is very pertinent to today, to our situation today. And for another reason, and that has to do with the same thing, because the dominant Enlightenment, Kant, Voltaire, etc., Descartes, Aristotle, has created a worldview that is actually, if you look at it, a sort of paint job in Christianity. Christianity has been repainted. The terms are different, the clothes are different, but the ideas are the same. Consider the place of reason in the deist Enlightenment. Reason is the noblest part of human life, material life. It is what you must aspire to. It is what you must privilege. Now the problem with that vision is that this wonderful reason is always attached to something that is troublesome and problematic. We call it a body, which is anti-irrational, which gets sick, which experiences lust, which ages, which has different ways of being at different ages, from a 3-year-old to a 30-year-old to a 90-year-old. So basically in this form of enlightenment, we must learn to distrust and suppress and police our body in the interest of our reason. which is exactly what Catholicism teaches us to do in the interest of our soul. And this is just one example. We could exercise this through in various examples, that what the deist Enlightenment does is it takes Christian ideas and reformulates them. Rousseau does the same very strongly. For Rousseau, it's especially the idea of original sin, the idea of natural wickedness, the idea of the wickedness of sex.
That's why you, in the last book, you talk about wicked people.
Well, you know, they were seen as wicked people. They were seen as wicked people.
Especially for Holbach, I believe.
But Holbach, you know, what an admirable man. I think, you know, he was not... It's interesting because Holbach was an immensely important figure in the 18th century. Also almost ignored. And let me tell you something, and this is really interesting. Holbach was not as subtle a thinker as Diderot, but his personal courage, I mean, he was also a rich man who spent a lot of money for these things, but his personal courage was immense, who didn't only write atheist pamphlets which could have gotten killed, and had them printed in Holland and smuggled back to be distributed like hard drugs, really, by clandestine sellers. And, you know, his sales reached something like 100,000 copies in the 18th century, which is enormous. If you imagine, you know, what it does to a whole educated class. But Holbach, this immensely important figure, for instance, who translates other books, who finances the printing of other books, who has this salon where the most brilliant people in Europe come together and talk about these things, who gives these things a voice and a place. He is practically forgotten. He is sort of treated as a vague precursor of Marxism. He was taught in the GDR, in the Soviet Union, like that. Today nobody's much interested in him. There is still no comprehensive and scholarly edition of his works. And the place where he assembled, the house where he assembled the most important people in the 18th century, a real epicenter of intellectual life of the 18th century. You can go to it today, it's still standing. First of all, most books cite the wrong house number and cite the house next door. But when you go there today, it's an investment firm, symbolically perhaps, and there are two guys in suits and one large pot plant. In that room that housed David Hume and Rousseau and Holbach and Diderot and Galliani and Lawrence Stern and you name it, everybody was there. But you know, there is no official acknowledgement of any kind what kind of place this was. There is no plaque to commemorate it. It is simply forgotten, like Holbach and Diderot are forgotten. It's interesting, you know, now for his 300th birthday, President François Hollande wants to put Diderot in the Panthéon finally, you know, where all the great French people go. First of all, that was tried several times before and it always failed. But secondly, it won't be that easy, because Holbach and Diderot were both buried in the same church, in the same chamber, in the same ossuary, so, you know, there. But twice in the French Revolution and in the Commune, this room was completely devastated, and there, you know, nobody knows whose bones belong to whom anymore. So how they want to put Diderot in the Panthéon, short of genetically testing every last bone in that room, will be an interesting question. But it is also a very symbolic idea that they are so dispersed, they are so scattered, they are so anonymous, that, you know, the memory of them is, as I say, Diderot was the encyclopedist who's written a big book full of interesting stuff. The fact that he was, you know, there's his enlightenment really, I think, is a much more fruitful one, because what this dominant enlightenment has led to still today, is that our so-called secular society is actually deeply theological, deeply religious in its thinking, in its tropes, in its structures, but we no longer realize it. We are still deeply Christian when it comes to dealing with the earth, when it comes to living in the future, when it comes to mind and matter, when it comes to morality, when it comes to trying to convince people that, if we think about morality, we should start with the fact that we are animals. And that all animals live in a moral universe, at least all higher animals. Certainly monkeys and dogs and cats live in moral universes. And they have an idea that their own will is sometimes opposed to the moral law that governs them. People find that horrifying, because they think, but where's our mind? Where's our moral judgment? Where's our free will? We are still a deeply Christian society without realizing it. And I think that is damaging and dangerous. If you want to be a Christian, be a Christian. I think you're wrong, but you have got a right to do that.
Yes.
But if you think in a Christian way without even realizing that you do that, then you've chosen it, then you're in a prison without knowing it. And I think Diderot's contribution to this is really to show you a way out of that prison.
Maybe that problem with the profound religion is the reason why Holbach hasn't been read that much in Latin America. Because, to be honest with you, till I read your book about wicked people, you make me read Holbach, but it wasn't easy to get Holbach.
No, it isn't. It still isn't. Now, the internet, of course, is a great help, because there's, first of all, you can now get all those French editions from Gallica, from the French, from the website, the wonderful website of the Bibliothèque Nationale in France,
Yes.
which have hundreds of thousands of out-of-copyright books scanned, so you can download them and read them in the original, which is immense and fantastic. But no, but also Diderot, there are writings of Diderot that were first published in the middle of the 20th century. And, again, it's very difficult to find a modern scholarly full edition of what he had done. It's very difficult to find good translations of his work. His three most famous novels are translated, but it is a real, what the Romans called the damnatio memoriae, where somebody's afterlife, somebody's singular afterlife is simply taken away from him because nobody remembers him anymore. And there comes also a manipulation, because you remember him as something else than what they really were.
There is a third character you talk in the book, Wicked People, which is Robespierre. But seems that Robespierre, at least to my understanding of your book, ends up with all the efforts to do the Enlightenment. He break with the both of them. He make a establishment where.
First of all, to be clear, the French Revolution happens after my guys are dead. Diderot dies in 84. Holbach dies very judiciously in January 89. But already the revolution hates them and detests them and prevents their books from being printed, and actually employs a literary critic to give public lectures against them and to ruin their memory. But more importantly, the French Revolution was not a revolution in the interest of human rights and tolerance. The French Revolution was a revolution of a bourgeoisie that wanted power. They had become, through the changes in the economy, through the changes in society, really more important than the aristocracy. They were fed up with being talked down to. And Robespierre is not interested in an egalitarian society. And therefore, first of all, he attacks the memory of those who have demanded it. But secondly, he finds as his prophet Rousseau. And literally as his prophet, because he has his bust hewn in stone. He makes huge processions and huge events in which Rousseau is basically venerated as a secular saint. And that is because of Rousseau's fantastic idea that in a really good society we need a prince who knows and who acts in our interest, because we have forgotten what our real interest is, what nature really wants us to do. But the prince knows, and therefore the prince, if necessary with violence, will lead us to the good path. Of course, that was something that Robespierre loved. So, what was Pierre and the French Revolution? There's something very ambivalent. Like you see that whenever somebody got too adventurous in his thinking in the revolution, he usually ended up in the guillotine. Somebody like Marcus Marmouth didn't make it for long. It was a bourgeois revolution, and that is understandable from the moment in history, but you mustn't mistake it with a revolution that was, revolution for human rights and tolerance and equality and brotherhood. It wasn't like that. It wasn't meant to be like that. And it was very intensely authoritarian very quickly, as indeed are all revolutions.
I asked you before about the idea of progress because one of the books that also came to Mexico is Vertigo Years. And I find it quite amusing because in this book you talk about the 14 first years of the 19th century.
15 actually.
15.
0 to 14.
Yeah. In which I find interesting because 1900 for all of us that we dedicate to philosophy and history is quite an important year. It's the age of the conference and the big meetings to try to really resize the world, to make new dimensions of the world. And not too many people talk about this. Why do you write about the first 15 years? Why not just 1900 as that big change?
Well, first of all, all of these categorizations are arbitrary to some extent. And then also, I think there was real change throughout that period. But what the axiom of this book is simply to realize this was not the sort of idyllic time before everything broke apart in the First World War. This was not the time when the world was still in order and everybody knew their place. But actually, this was a time in which the world exploded and nobody knew what they were and who they were. Why did it explode? And this is interesting, and it brings me back to what I said earlier. It is sort of a history, a chapter in the cultural history of technology. Because it's industrialization, of course, that makes that happen. Industrialization that changes classes, that creates urbanization, that creates different identities in modern cities than in traditional villages, that creates different sexual identities and gender roles between men and women. But this is all, it all begins with technology. Again, it's very much embodied. And I found it fascinating to show that, to demonstrate that, how this happens and how, you can look at works of art, at novels, pieces of music, but also the love of sport, of fast machines, and as manifestations, as symptoms of this new development. It was sort of as if the world had taken, crack cocaine or got a huge adrenaline shot, and everybody had so much energy, the world had so much energy, but you didn't know what to do with it. People, it's quite a frequent trope at the time that people say, it is as if I'm on a very fast train, and I don't know how the points are set. That's how Max Weber put it. So, you're rushing forward, but you don't know in which direction it's going. And that's why I call it vertigo years, because vertigo is a feeling that is exhilarating, but also potentially frightening. And, you don't know. I'm always interested in times of, if I were more pretentious, I would say paradigm change, but, times where new things become possible, when old structures break open, crack open, and new things begin to manifest themselves. And usually in these things, of course, we are in the middle of such a period ourselves, because our big technologies are exploding so much, but also what we're doing to our, to the basis of our survival and to this planet is so catastrophic that we are creating huge changes. I think we're every bit in danger that if people in 200 years look back on us, they won't think that the most devastating and the most terrible generation was the generation of the 1930s and 40s, but the one of the 2000s. Because we the thing is, in the early 20th century, people didn't know what would happen, but they also, they didn't know the First World War would happen. So this wasn't a pre-war time. This was just, a time that was developing. But they also didn't know what they should do. There were various models and various attempts. The paradoxical thing is that today we know exactly what we should do. Scientists have made very clear and shown us, and of course science is not the truth. Science is only as good as the model that it has. It's always subject to being refined and changed, but there's a very broad consensus that there are certain things we must do, and there are certain things we must not do. And then there are scenarios that you can simulate, and they're more or less catastrophic, but they're all pretty bad.
But we don't do nothing.
Exactly. And that's why I think that history may just judge us very harshly, because we are locked in this market transcendence so much that it is perfectly clear what we should do with renewable energies, what we should do with consumption of energy and of goods. We know that our clothes that we buy so cheaply in chain stores, and that it doesn't matter if you buy another shirt or another t-shirt, because it costs $10 or $5, and that's the price of a cup of coffee. We know that that's what was produced under slave labor conditions somewhere in Asia by an 8-year-old child, or a woman who has to stay at a sewing machine for 14 hours a day. But we don't care enough. And some of us, try to do something, but that's the thing. It's no good to say the corporations are evil, the corporations are doing that.
We are evil.
It is our dollars that make these decisions possible. If we withhold, this wonderful little book by Etienne de la Boétie, Servitude Volontaire. Etienne de la Boétie was basically Michel de Montaigne's boyfriend, but he died very young. And Servitude Volontaire, voluntary servitude, has devastatingly simple base idea, which is that authority rests only on the shoulders of those who carry it out. And if somebody says kill him, and that person says no, then authority is broken. If nobody else will do that either, then this authority is broken. La Boétie compares it to a fire that is no longer fit, the flames die. Authority is nothing else than consent. And we give this consent with our dollars, with our consumer decisions, because we are in our democracies are more and more farces, are more and more, politicians, even well-meaning politicians, I believe there are well-meaning politicians, have fewer and fewer actual decisions they can make. And we are less and less citizens and more consumers. And we are treated as such.
The only thing we have about democracy is the name.
Yes, but if we had a meaningful revolution tomorrow, that revolution would have to be against the economic structures, not the political ones. Political ones don't matter enough anymore. That's a tragedy. But I think there is, for very legitimate reasons also, not just because they're wicked, evil corporate giants who do bad things to us. First of all, we make these bad things possible. But secondly, there are also actually genuine problems. I was listening to a German political scientist who said the problem is, it was a very striking thought, I thought. The problem is democracy was developed to slow down decisions. Because, if you have one person who says, I want this, and that's a bad idea, then you're stuck with it. But democracy is developed to slow this down, to create processes of consultation and discussion and elections and things like that. But in a time when markets go in milliseconds, and when you have to say something for the opening of the markets in Asia in 3 hours' time, this slowed down rhythm of decision making is all of a sudden a problem. And we have not yet found an intelligent way out of this. This is not just to do with corporate evil giants, but this is a genuine problem of democracy with the development of technology that we have.
one of the points I was trying to end up with the conversation, but now that you talked about this, I think it's important, is that when you talk about the 17th century, when you talk about 17th, 19th century, and when you talk about the 20th century, it seems that there is more than the idea of progress. There is people that wants to try to change the world. That people that try to think the world and resize it or change in a paradigmatic way. Nowadays, it seems that the debate is empty. I don't know.
I don't think it's empty. As I say again, it is in many ways very clear what has to happen.
Yes.
So there is no much point about having a debate whether climate change is happening or not. This is not a subject of debate anymore. I mean, as much as anything in science is no longer a subject of debate. But it's no point reopening the debate whether the Earth is the center of the universe after all. We've done that. And we could all be wrong, and there could all be an amazingly complicated explanation that we've all overlooked. But basically we don't need that. With climate change there's a broad scientific consensus that this is happening. And incidentally, even if climate change were simply a natural rhythm that happened because the Earth warms up and cools down every now and then, there were ice ages even before there was industrialization, all true. But what have we got to lose by using more sustainable energies? What have we got to lose by having cleaner air to breathe? So, it is all good. It's a win-win situation. But it requires us all to be a bit more modest. We all have, not all, I say this in Mexico, and there are poor people here. Poor people who don't have a franchise. Poor people who don't have a choice, poor people with very little education. But I'm talking about the people who participate in this education process. We all have immensely more than, for instance, our parents and grandparents did. I had a conversation with Richard Sennett the other day, and he said, don't forget that the generation of my parents and grandparents, and he was roughly 70, I think, everybody only had one or two suits. That was normal. And if you had a bit of money, there was nothing you could spend it on. Because the shops weren't overflowing with goods. And that of course also meant that your construction of identity was a different one. Because you didn't identify yourself so much with a brand. Which incidentally brings us back to the idea of secular transcendence. Because you're a Tommy Hilfiger guy. Or an Armani person, or and we get this transcendence of photo models who look fantastic, but who make us inadequate because they are actually not real people. They are lit and made up, and they have hungered themselves to a weight that is then photoshopped down another 20%. They are not real. They're as unreal as the saints in Christianity were. But we think, because we simply love the idea that there is a transcendent world that is true and that we must aspire to, we think that we are inadequate vis-a-vis them, but they don't even exist. If you read these models, they're not that cool and fantastic and that thick. But I think the comfort of having a greater meaning is something that we sacrifice an awful lot too, and unfortunately also the comfort of being comfortable is something that we sacrifice our future and the future of other generations too. We know what should happen. It's not much of a question. But, and here's another problem of democracy, of course. If you're elected for 4 years and part of a party machine that needs to support you, you can't say, oh, we're going to do this. I genuinely believe that Obama had an awful lot of good intentions, and really, all these things are completely clear. But he had no chance of carrying these things out. So he may have given up. And anyway, stuff happens in politics. So also taking some genuinely very problematic decisions. But I think he was actually a highly intelligent man with enormous energy and great charisma who had all the right ideas. But in a democracy, that's not enough. And, yes, that's a problem, but as Churchill says, democracy is the worst of all forms of government, aside from all the others.
Yes, and one of the things I see in common with all your characters, and in the critic you do too about the idea of progress, is that the characters you choose are morally strong. They have a strong conviction of themselves and the kind of world they see. They are not weakened by other kind of ideas or the market or politics. They are strong people.
It's an interesting idea. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting idea, and you see me really thinking about it. I think that sometimes it is not a question of strength. It's certainly not necessarily a question of free will, because there may not be any. The jury is still out on that, and anyway, it's certainly much more subtle and complicated than simply freedom to decide. And we already know that, but of course, and this incidentally is another religious idea we're hanging on to, because without free will in religion there would be no sin and no redemption. So free will is essential to a religious worldview. But, I mean, think of what would happen to our criminal justice system if we didn't assume that there was free will. We couldn't lock anyone up. We couldn't accuse anyone of doing something. We would have to deal with crime and with antisocial behavior in a very different way. And I think we will have to do so. And, of course, to some extent that is already realized. When we know that practically everybody who's sexually abusing children has been abused himself, then the idea of free will doesn't look very strong then. But I think, for instance, something that I suspect Diderot, something that I think I would recognize in myself, is simply an immense fascination for things. That is not necessarily strength or discipline, but it's just, it's too interesting to me to learn. I think people who move something need to be fascinated in that way. Need to have that drive, but yes, it's true, I'm just thinking because in the Vertigo years, and also in the book that I'm just finishing, which is sort of the second part of the Vertigo years, dealing with the interwar period, I am actually consciously trying not to write a history of heroic individuals, but a history of communities and societies, and a cultural history of technology, and sort of anthropology of how we're dealing with that. The question in the 1900s is how do we deal with immense change? The question in the 1920s and 30s is how do we live in a world in which all values have become invalid, in which everything we were taught to believe in has evaporated. I don't think I'm only interested in strong people. In the Encyclopédie and in the Wicked Company, as it is called in English, the Gente Peligrosa in Spanish, yes, I am interested in exceptional individuals, but also because it is simply, it is a sort of moment of onlooking and focusing. And, exceptional ideas often come out of exceptional individuals. But as I say, these individuals can only be exceptional not because they're born as humans, but because they react to, respond to a particular historical situation. 80 years later, 50 years later, their ideas may no longer have been very interesting. Or they may have reacted to things in a very different, less much as interesting way. It's also a question of luck. Whether you happen to be at a moment, and we are at a copiously interesting moment, and unfortunately the present is always filled with fog. Afterwards, it's easy to see the causalities of history. What leads to what started where. But when you're in it, I think of myself as a fairly robust capitalist. I think socialism is a wonderful idea, but it will always lead to dictatorship. It will always lead to dictatorship because it can really only work if everybody has the same conviction and the same willingness to sacrifice. And that works in a voluntary community, but it doesn't work in a country.
Yes, because not all of us have the same strength.
No, and also not all of us choose to be part of this.
Yes.
In a country, and that is again, that is a sort of Diderotian form, that if you have a country, you need to do what works. Because you're dealing with people whom you cannot convince of your point of view, who want different things. And that is today very important thing. And I'm just thinking whether that is true from Mexico to the same extent, and I have to confess to you that I simply don't know. But in Europe, one of the main questions about society is immigration. And for the first time in known history, we have the phenomenon that we are dealing with migrants who come from genuinely different cultural backgrounds. They're not Christians, for instance, or shall we say, they're not even post-Christians. And it was much, all European countries have always had great degrees of migration. We like to forget that, but for the last 2,000 years, people have ceaselessly moved around in Europe and have created new societies and new identities. But now this, of course, and also our human rights discourse, of course, puts this on a different footing. So we have to learn to deal with genuine difference. Which is something very different. To a large extent, this is a class problem, not a cultural problem. Many migrants, by definition, are poor and uneducated. And poor and uneducated people make different choices. And perhaps poorer choices. But, that has nothing to do with that many of them are Muslim. They could be Hindu, they could be Christian, they could be atheists. If they are, poor and uneducated people look at the world differently and have different priorities. But, it is, as I say, a very Diderotian challenge. How do you run a good society in which people can live life to its fullest? In this wonderful formulation of the American Constitution, a formulation that very possibly came from Diderot and Holbach's dinner table, because Benjamin Franklin was there. Pursuit of happiness, which of course doesn't mean that you have a right to be happy. Yes, but you have a right to have a crack at it. And that is why I think today in European societies, and that is something very difficult to convince people of, it can only work if they're secular societies. Because if we have genuine differences, genuinely different priorities, this can only work if we have a minimal baseline of shared values, a minimal baseline of shared priorities. Then people can, on top of that, do their own thing and make different choices that other people violently disagree with. But if we don't have that, we have actually no society. We have only a bunch of people living in one place. And
a recipe for destructiveness.
Pardon?
Yeah, the recipe for conflict and...
Yes, at best they will ignore each other, and at worst they will fight each other. But, and of course this is something that people get very wound up about. For instance, a very unfortunate example perhaps, but it was an example with many very unfortunate resonances. About a year ago, there was a case brought because a little boy had been circumcised by his Muslim parents, and the circumcision had gone wrong. And so they sued the doctor, and the judge who was hearing this case said that in his legal opinion, circumcision of children constituted grievous bodily harm. Because the children were he didn't make a judgment on the culture, on religion, or even on the medical benefits of circumcision. He simply said, if you submit someone to a surgical procedure without his consent, because he's too young to give his consent, and if this is a medical procedure that is not medically indicated, then that is not okay. And of course, all hell broke loose. Anti-Semitism because against Jews, anti-Islamism, and that was a terrible thing. But actually, I can't see why the judge wasn't right. And I think if you think of a different, perhaps less emotional example, you can see where this is going. Because, and you're a legal theorist, now don't think not of Mosaic religion and circumcision. Think of West African scarification. People who have ornamental scars and patterns on their breast and on their cheeks and on their shoulders can look beautiful. And it is culturally important, it is cultural identity, it's an expression of cultural identity. Now imagine that two wonderful West African parents come with a 3-year-old boy or girl to a doctor and say, can you please do this for us? We really want to make our child the present of our cultural identity. No doctor would agree to that. And he would be sued, and rightly so, if he would. Which doesn't mean that, if the kid is 18 and decides that I want not only piercings and tattoos, but scarifications and circumcision, you can't choose that for yourself. But these are secular rules in a society that I think must be respected. And if they collide with traditional views, to my mind, and that is a very unpopular view, the secular rules must prevail.
Giorgio Campbell once said that maybe we didn't even live or start the modern ages. We live still in the feudal ages.
Yes, we are in many ways very primitive. And certainly the Enlightenment hasn't even come halfway. And that's what I mean. That's why this is such an important thought for me, to say we are still thinking deeply theologically. And that is okay for theologians.
But not for us.
It is not okay if you don't even realize that you're doing it. We must achieve this realization to see that in how far the structures of our thought are impregnated with religious thinking. And then we can think whether we want this or not. And that's fine, that's then a conscious decision. But we don't even know that this is happening. And of course, as science is progressing, this is becoming, and science is really progress. There you have progress. Stuff works better than it did before. You can now make a heart operation on a fetus in the womb, which is sort of unfathomable and incredible. But the problem is that scientific progress has nothing to do with intellectual and cultural progress. Islamic terrorists who blow people up with mobile phones and who use the internet to set this up, and who use plastic explosives, they use the technology of the 21st century with the mindset of the 11th century. Progress is not automatic here. And progress is simply also limited by the fact that we are, as I say again, we're animals, we're tribal. We think in our little tribes, in our little groups. There's a new book out by a scholar called Anthony Packton, who argues that actually the real goal of the Enlightenment is not rationality, but cosmopolitanism. And I find that a very interesting thought. And that is something that we need very, very badly. But again, cosmopolitanism can only work if we not only recognize ourselves in others, but also have certain values, and those values must be secular, because they must be utilitarian. They must be basically what works. I've once thought that actually a fairly good image of that is traffic rules. If you stand on a crossing and somebody comes up from the right of you, you know that you need to give this person priority. not because of that person's personal aspirations, or what he comes from, or what he has experienced, or whether he's beautiful, or whether, but simply because he's on the right. It is an agreement. It is simply purely contingent. We could do differently. We could say they're more environmentally friendly, or women have priority, or red cars. No, but we have decided this, and it works. But it is not a statement about identities and aspirations. It is a statement about functionalities in a given situation. And I think that values underpinning our working societies must be like that. And, of course, once you come with a revealed truth, that is unfortunately not the same as other revealed truths, or maybe the same as other revealed truths, but always works out in the way that you will oppress women. You will give women and girls fewer rights, never mind homosexuals or blacks. Then that is simply not acceptable in a society. And that is a view that people find wildly intolerant. And people are scandalized when we say things like that. But I do think that I cannot conceive of a better way of running a society and of giving people the possibility of expressing different ambitions and identities. Because only if you have that does a really multicultural society become possible, where you can be different things and have different ambitions for yourself. And I think that's the sort of society we need. We need to have societies that are multiple, societies that have different views of things, where different views are represented, where different possibilities, different ways of thinking, different identities. No great cultural development has ever happened without migrants and immigrants, without difference. We need difference. We need the friction that creates. And that is always difficult and always frustrating. But we need that to develop a richer world, not a financially richer world, a culture, to develop better answers, brighter answers to the problems we face. But that's why I think this perhaps just a sort of closing thought. One thing that I haven't yet even mentioned, many things I haven't mentioned, but one thing that is very important, relevant in this, I sketched out earlier in our talk the importance that reason has for the deist enlightenment. See? For the radical enlightenment, especially for Diderot, it's not reason but passion. Very often explicitly erotic passion. But eros is not only sexual. Eros can be social. Eros can be in friendship. Eros can be in art. And again, it's a sort of idea that we're evolved animals and we're here to reproduce. And that is what drives us. But actually, this eros, which could be very egocentric, in Marquis de Sade, that's of course what he exercised. But for Diderot, there's something else that's very important. That's empathy, which is just as natural. I don't know whether you have children, but you haven't yet taught a 2-year-old morality, but a 2-year-old shows empathy. Actually, a dog shows empathy. And between eros and empathy, you can actually build a whole morality. You don't need anything else. You certainly don't need anything transcendent. And this idea that we are not here to suppress ourselves to reach some transcendent goal, but we are here to perhaps use reason to find more intelligent ways of living our erotic nature is, I think, for many people a very threatening one. For me, a very liberating one.
That's quite interesting. Professor Blom, has been a pleasure to talk with you about your books. As I told you in the email, we are quite fans of your work.
Thank you.
I find it really interesting to read it. I can wait to see the next book so I can read it. And it has been a pleasure to talk.
Thank you.